Would it be off at the end?
Yeah, all right. So guys, let's just get on with it. I wanted to explain to you that there was a statement last time that Rav made, and Rav Huna said in the name of Rav, if one says to his fellow, a man of mine is in your possession, another the guy responds, you don't have anything in my possession. In other words, there's denial. And he swears to that effect. And afterwards, witnesses come and attest to his guilt. He's exempt from payment because it's stated, if you remember, and its owner shall accept it and he shall not pay. So that teaches that once the owner's received an oath, the defendant no longer pays money. Why? Because if somebody is that despicable that they take out a Torah scroll, they're warning about all the punishments in Shemaim about taking a false oath, and he takes a false oath. Sometimes if somebody's an arch criminal, you just, especially in those times where people were scared to use the name of Hashem, there's very little you can do. Hashem will give you every Rosh Hashanah, by the way, what you allotted to, and every expense will be taken off. So for somebody that doesn't believe in God, it's a much more stressing situation. And in case one thinks that they have a high level of emunah, I wish none of you, including myself, to be tested in this regard, because we go to pieces when money disappears. I can tell you that from experience. Whatever level of emunah we think we're holding on, it's not so high, believe me. So, since that's the case, Rav elucidates Rav's ruling, because Rav has said Rav's ruling is reasonable regarding a loan. Why a loan? We went through this concept because it's given to a borrower to be spent. So since the original money no longer exists and the debtor would be required to pay back with his own funds at a later time juncture, it's reasonable to interpret the verse, and he shall not pay, as exempting him if he says under oath, there was never a loan that takes place, and the other guy is so stupid he doesn't have a document to prove such a thing with witnesses. It's very difficult to ethereally corner a person where there's a lack of evidence. That's why you need witnesses. But as for a deposit, guys, it's a bit different. Why? Because according to Rav, in the name of Rav, is that it always remains in the possession of the owner. In other words, it's unreasonable to interpret, and he shall pay, as exempting the custodian from returning it to the rightful owner. Why? Because if they see evidence of the person's article, you can't exactly sit back and expect that oath just to adjure him in a point of innocence, because the item remains the owner's property, even if it's held by the custodian. And this phrase, he shall not pay, seems obviously inapplicable here, according to Rashi. Why? Because it's not logical to exempt a defendant whose case has been settled when the issue at hand is almost evidential when you can see the item in the person's home. It's different with an erasure of debt. Okay, so the question in the Gemara is, how can we just simply say that the custodian is now entitled to keep the original owner's property simply because the case was already settled in court? This is an issue brought up by the Chazon Ish. Okay, so because we want to know that Rav stated his ruling even in regard to deposit, so we can understand in regard to loan. But then we want to know where the verses that Rav expounded it from, because at the end of the day, Rav said it's written regarding a deposit, meaning if you look at the original pasuk, the whole reason the verse is brought in terms of a custodian is because its owner has to accept the oath and the defendant shall not pay. And it's only stated in the passage of a custodian. It's actually not stated in the pasuk regarding a loan. So obviously then, according to Rav's interpretation, the verse exempts even in a weird case where a custodian who swears that the deposit was, maybe it was a lamb and a wolf got it or whatever, even in that case it exempts him if he's stupid enough to use the name of Hashem in vain. So Rav maintains that once the court has ruled that the custodian is exempt on the basis of his oath, you can't reopen the case. Even though later there's witnesses that come against this fellow's property, or there's evidence that it's in the custodian's property. And we learn it from the following Mishnah in 108b. And there's going to be obviously counter arguments to this. If one said to an unpaid custodian, Where is my deposit that I entrusted to your care? And the custodian replies, it was lost, and I am exempt from payment. We don't mean he lost it. We meant it was lost like a wolf runs away with the sheep. But we don't mean it was stolen like from another human being. Because an unpaid custodian is exempt from liability for an item entrusted to him, because remember, he wasn't paid, so he's not under the same obligations of watchmanship as somebody that was paid to do the service, and he's basically exempt from liability for the item entrusted to him. And obviously, in the case of gross negligence, he's liable. But if he claims that the item was stolen or lost without negligence on his part, he still has to take a shavua to that effect, and therefore exempt himself. Where is this in Bava Kamma 93a? Because although he wasn't paid for his service, he's not entitled to keep that which is not his. So then the owner of the article says to him, I adjure you that your response is true, and the custodian has to say Amen. And why does he say Amen? It means that answering Amen constitutes an acceptance of the oath, and this is equivalent to uttering it. So that's in the Gemara of Oaths, 29b Shavuos. And by saying Amen, the custodian's taken the oath that the deposit was lost without negligence on his part, but he needs that in order to exempt himself from payment. Basically, then the owner says to him, I adjure you, and your response is true, and the custodian says Amen. He's accepted the oath. And afterwards, when there are witnesses that testify against the custodian that he consumed it himself, the custodian pays only the principal, the value of the deposit. So what is this coming to say? We first learn that Rav is explaining. Rav is saying, look, if somebody makes an oath and says that the deposit was lost, the case is shut, and witnesses afterwards can't turn around and come against the custodian and say, well, we saw you take it into your house. It's a shut case. But this is an argument in our Mishnah to say, no, it's not a shut case. Because even if he took the oath, witnesses that come afterwards and give evidence against the custodian that he consumed it himself, the custodian only pays the principal, the value of the deposit. We're going to see now why there's no kefil double payment, why there's no 1/5 payment on the asham. But the proof of it is, if he has to pay back the principal, the value of the deposit, it means this is an argument against Rav. Okay. Now, interestingly enough, why is the custodian not liable to the kefil payment, which is the twofold payment, which is the principal, and the penalty is the same amount? In other words, he stole 100 zuz. He kept 100 zuz worth of an item for himself. He pays 100 zuz for the principal and 100 zuz as a penalty. But that penalty, guys, is only levied against an unpaid custodian when he exempts himself by claiming that the deposit was stolen. Okay? In other words, a thief, it says, a thief shall pay double. So what we're saying is, if a custodian says that somebody stole from him and it's found that he kept the item, he's treated as a thief, and that's why he pays double. But if he claims that it was lost, meaning a wolf came and took the sheep, in that case, he doesn't have to pay double, because what he tries to do is done to him. Does that make sense, Kevin? So that kefil payment is only on a false claim of theft. Okay. Furthermore, he's not liable to the 1/5 surcharge and the asham offering, guys, because he's not interested in atonement. So he didn't confess his guilt. It says in Numbers chapter 5, verse 7, that it's for somebody that's looking to purge themselves of sin. And this person was caught up by witnesses. So a custodian remains liable to pay even after he swears. This is an argument against Rav. So the challenge to Rav arises only from the Mishnah's first ruling. Okay? That the custodian is liable to pay when witnesses subsequently testify to his guilt. Whereas Rav seemed to infer that it's a shut case. Once a person's prepared to do an oath, it doesn't matter what happens afterwards. The case is closed. But the Mishnah's second ruling, that the custodian is liable to pay the principal and a first surcharge when the custodian confesses, that doesn't pose any difficulty for Rav, because Rav can't exempt somebody who confesses to perjury from paying on his own, because this is the person is believed, and when he makes a false oath is entitled to a teshuvah, and therefore in Vayikra, Leviticus chapter 5 verse 23, it states explicitly that with respect to a perjurer who confesses, he shall return the robbed item that he robbed. Okay, so obviously plus the surcharge and the asham offering, because that's part of his atonement. So Rav mentions the exemption only regarding a defendant who is actually apprehended by witnesses, because payment would have been exacted by the court. So we're saying if he's in that particular case, the case is shut. But if he obviously incriminates himself afterwards to get atonement, he can pay. But witnesses cannot come against him. Whereas our Mishnah in the 108th daf of Bava Kamma says that, well, if the witnesses that are presented against this person, this custodian, and he's taken a false oath, in that particular case, he's got to make the principal, because he claims it was lost. If he claims it was stolen, he pays the kefil, he pays double. There is no atonement for him, and witnesses can work against him. Rav said it can't. Now what we want to know is there's this particular response by Rav Nachman, who said to Rav Acha Mani Yume, what are we dealing with here? It's a case where the custodian swore outside the court. So what are we saying? Look, at any rate, the Mishnah's first clause states that if the custodian swore to the fact that he is innocent and it's contradicted by witnesses, he's got to pay the principal. But what Rav Nachman is trying to say here is an oath taken outside the court doesn't have the gravity and the seriousness to free the swearer from the plaintiff's claim against him, even if it's an oath that is required biblically. Why? Because the verse that Rav is referring to as the source of the exemption, firstly, it's brought it up with regards to a custodian, because that is the chiddush, not with the loan, because that money is spent. And you can retrieve the article because it's either still in existence or it in no ways is like money spent by the debtor. Okay, so the exemption refers specifically to a court-imposed oath, according to Rashi. So when the court imposes a derisive oath, a biblical oath, it requires the swearer to invoke the name of Hashem and to hold a sacred object like a Torah scroll while uttering an oath in court, and forewarns them as to the dire consequences of swearing falsely. Okay, this is by the Chosn Ish and Rashi. Okay, so what Rav Nachman is saying is perhaps the whole reason why the custodian has to pay at this point is it's not a contradiction to Rav. It's that the oath was taken outside the court on a more informal basis. So Rav Acha Mani Yume counters and he says to Rav Nachman, okay, so if you want to consider the Mishnah's latter case, where the owner said to the unpaid custodian, like, where's my deposit that I entrusted to your care? And the custodian said, what are you talking about? It was stolen and I'm exempt from payment. And the owner says to him, I adjure you that your response is true. I'm not sure it's true. You've got to actually give me an oath. And the custodian says, Amen. And afterwards, witnesses testify against the custodian that he stole it himself. The custodian pays the twofold payment. Okay, so what we are saying is here, is if the unpaid custodian exempts himself from liability by claiming and swearing falsely that the deposit was stolen as opposed to lost, witnesses come and testify that he stole it himself. What he claims, what happened that a thief did to him, he's treated as a thief and therefore he pays the kefil payment. But what's this whole thing prove? We'll see now. If the custodian admitted of his own accord that he swore falsely afterwards, guys, because he felt bad, he then has to he doesn't pay the kefil the double payment. He pays the principal and the one for surcharge and brings an asham offering for atonement. Now, Rav Acha Bar Manyamuni says to Rav Nachman is that if it should enter your mind that the Mishnah is dealing with a case where the custodian swore outside the court, how can it be? Because is there any twofold payment for a oath taken outside the court? In other words, what we're saying is as follows. Guys, listen carefully. Only a court-imposed oath that is actually taken in court renders a custodian liable to the kefil payment. How do we know this? Remember in Shmot, in Exodus chapter 22, verse 7, the householder shall approach the court to swear. Whomever the court finds guilty shall pay twofold to his fellow, which means it's a court-imposed oath. So this suggestion by Rav Nachman that it seems to agree with Rav that it's an oath taken outside the court, and therefore it doesn't free the custodian that's caught swearing falsely by witnesses to almost be indemnified, because because he swore out of court. Because the counter argument is, well, if he's caught by witnesses, why would he have to pay a twofold payment? That twofold payment is only triggered with a court imposed oath, number one. And number two, why would he pay the principal and 1/5 and bring an ashram offering as a surcharge? Because that only occurs if it's a legal case, because less than a pruta, remember, there's no 1/5 surcharge in an ashram. So it has to be more than a pruta, and it has to be in court. So this is an argument against Rav Nachman. So Rav Nachman replies, look, he says to Rav Acha Bar Manyamuni, he says to him, look, I could stretch the answer a bit and say to you that maybe the first clause of the Mishnah deals with a case where the defendant swore outside of court. Okay? In other words, it's not going to indemnify him if he's caught by witnesses afterwards. His oath isn't stronger than witnesses. Whereas Rav said the case is closed, and even if witnesses come afterwards, it's too late. So I'm not going to say it was outside of court. I'm not going to stretch the answer that one. And I'm not going to stretch the latter clause that deals with a case where he swore in court. In other words, so that it suits me. So he said, because that's a bit of a stretch. There's nowhere in the Mishnah that hints to that. I could give you that clever answer, but it's like a bit of a stretch. In other words, it's true. You can't argue against it, but it's there. It becomes a bit of a poetic license of an interpretive nature. However, I shall not answer you with the forced answer in that regard. Rather, I will explain both this clause and that clause as dealing with the case where he swore in court. Yet there's no difficulty. So, guys, at this point, you should be puzzled how he's going to get out of this trap. So it's quite clever. He says, look, here in the very first clause, we are dealing with a case where the plaintiff jumped up and personally adjured the custodian before the court imposed the oath upon him. Okay? In other words, the oath that the defendant took was not a court-imposed oath, even though it happened in court, and therefore it doesn't exempt him from paying in the future. So in other words, what happened was the plaintiff turned around, got excited, and said to the defendant in court, the custodian, I know you took it. I think you took it. I want you to swear to me now you didn't take it. And the guy says, yeah. He said, okay. He says, well, look, I adjure you to give your oath. He says, yeah, command, I give my oath. And because the plaintiff jumped the gun and he didn't follow court procedure, it's almost of an informal basis, even if. So that was the first answer. Then the second answer is, he said, look, if you look at the latter clause, we are dealing with a case where the plaintiff did not jump up and personally adjure the custodian, but allowed the court to impose the oath upon him. Okay? So the latter clause can't be dealing with a case where the plaintiff actually adjured the custodian on his own. Because remember, only perjury in the course of a court-imposed oath renders the custodian liable to kefil. But, guys, we can interpret the first clause as dealing with the case where the plaintiff got excited. He adjured the custodian before the court was able to do so within a court setting, but it still was on a more informal basis. So, although the interpretation is somewhat forced in the two clauses, because we're not precisely dealing with the same situation, it's definitely vacant. I must tell you something, these updates are not of an excellent nature. Sometimes if something ain't broken, what the heck are you tampering with it for? I just don't get it. This is what I hate about computers. I really hate that about computers, is that it just, everything does its own thing, always. Just give me a second, guys. All right, we back on. So, in other words, Rav Nachman wasn't trying to say, okay, the one was done outside of court and the one was done in court. He was just saying, listen, I'm not going to stretch it to that degree. It's both in court. The one, the plaintiff jumped the gun and court procedure wasn't followed, because if it was, then the oath would indemnify the defendant, even though the custodian lied and used it for himself. In the second case, the plaintiff had the common sense to keep quiet, and the court boxed them in, and it actually helped in this case the defendant more than the plaintiff. Okay. So, in other words, he's not saying it occurred in different places. He's just saying that the formality basis was different. Now, let's just go. We're just going to relate a conversation regarding the preceding answer. So Rami Bava Kamma said to Rav Nachman, okay, let's see. I know that you don't concur with the ruling of Rav, because you heard him say privately that he obviously doesn't hold by Rav because he has his own Masorah from his rabbis. So basically, Rami Bava Kamma was saying, well, why are you defending Rav? And Rav Nachman replied to him, I'm merely coming to explain the opinion of Rav, because Rav is of the highest level, and even though I learned from a different pathway, Rav is entitled to be clarified, because this is how Rav interprets the Mishnah. Now, this is always an important case, because if you look at Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, Kevin, I remember hearing a shir at Sunny Road where basically that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, even though they were completely different opinions, they were allowed to marry into each other's houses, meaning that they had such reverence and respect for each other that they quoted the other rabbi's opinion before their own rabbinic opinion. That was the level of respect. And they never, Gavin, I can see you falling asleep a little. I know you've had a long day. Don't worry, you won't be long. And so it's a good lesson that Rav Nachman, even if he learned different to Rav, knew exactly how Rav interpreted the Mishnah, was not disparaging, and did everything to defend Rav. So the Gemara says, well, how can anybody disagree with Rav? How can there be a different opinion? Because Rav's a genius. Because Rav cited a verse as the source of his ruling. What was the ruling? The verse actually comes to teach a different rule, that all who swear to rise under biblical law swear and do not pay, for he expounds the phrase, its owner shall accept the oath, and the defendant shall not pay, as teaching that the one upon whom it would be incumbent to pay, if he loses the case, is the one who swears. So all it's saying is that the verse teaches a different lesson, okay? That the Torah imposes oaths only on a defendant, unless the defendant has got a track record of lying, and it's the defendant who swears in order to free himself of the plaintiff's charge. Never, unless the defendant has a track record of lying or is a criminal, does the Torah empower plaintiff to swear in order to corroborate his claim and thereby collect, because Rashi said the onus on the person trying to extract money is the person that has to bring the evidence. So the verse indicates that one who is sued for payment swears in order to exempt himself. The one suing for payment does not swear to corroborate his claim. Okay. And it deals with different oaths: custodian's oath, oath of partial admission, the oath of a single witness, the oath against a single witness, etc., etc. Okay. Now, the Gemara presents another challenge to Rav's ruling. Rav Hamnuna challenged Rav from the following Mishnah, which deals with one who swears falsely in denial of a monetary claim, and that's in Shavuos 36b. Okay, if the plaintiff had the defendant adjured 5 times regarding the same claim, either in court or outside of court, and the defendant denied the claim made against him, he's liable to the one for surcharge and the asham offering for each and every false oath of denial. So Rabbi Shimon said, what is the reason for this? Okay. Now, it's pretty straightforward. We have gone through this before. Is because each time he was adjured, the defendant could have come clean, guys. He could have retracted and admitted that he indeed owes the money. He's liable to pay. So each denial under oath is significant, and therefore he has to atone for each and every sin. Now, here you can't say that the Mishnah deals with the case where the plaintiff jumped up and personally adjured the defendant, because the Mishnah uses very specific words, guys. If the plaintiff had the defendant adjured, so if you have somebody adjured, it means the plaintiff did not adjure the defendant and say, I want you to swear to me. He had the court adjure the defendant and followed court procedure. So he had a court-imposed oath. You also can't say that the Mishnah, guys, is dealing with the case where he swore outside of court, because what does the Mishnah say? The words in court. The plaintiff had the defendant adjured, which means had to be in court, and the defendant and the plaintiff followed the procedure where the court adjured the defendant and he had to take an oath. So, nevertheless, the Mishnah says each of the defendant's subsequent oath is significant because at any point he could have admitted liability. So we see that even after the defendant takes a court-imposed oath, he remains liable to pay. So what's the whole point? That's in direct contradiction to Rav. Okay? Because Rav Anuna cited the Mishnah as a challenge to Rav, understands that Rav as exempting the perjurer from paying, even if he confesses to his guilt. So in other words, he's saying that once he's taken an oath, etc., he's kind of protected. So Rav Hamnuna actually said, look, we need to resolve this. So he said, this is a challenge you could have, and this is how I propose to resolve it. He never had the question, Rav Hamnuna. He said, it's a common question, and this is how you resolve it. If the Mishnah states that the plaintiff had the defendant adjured, either in court or outside the court, it's actually teaching about 2 separate cases. If you've got the clause had him adjured, which means the court imposed the oath, that applies specifically to a case where the defendant then took the oath outside of court. In other words, he still followed the court process, but it was done outside the court grounds. And the court, and basically, the case where the oath was taken in court applies where the plaintiff jumped the gun and personally adjured the defendant. Okay, so this phrase "either in court" doesn't refer back to the opening clause that he had him adjured, right? It refers to a case where the plaintiff either got involved and messed up the process where the court couldn't get the defendant to take an oath, or it refers to the fact that there was a court-imposed oath, but it didn't take on the same sort of mandatory nature. It was more of a voluntarily, more on a relaxed sort of basis. Okay, so basically, let's simplify. The Mishnah teaches that if you take a voluntary oath, even in court, or you take a mandatory oath outside of court, and then confesses that he lies, he's got to pay. So Rav's ruling that once he swears he's exempt from payment is inapplicable in either case, because it has to be in the perfect setting of in court with a court-imposed oath. Okay, so Rav Hamnuna's challenge to Rav from the Mishnah, which stated that the defendant could have retracted and admitted liability, was based on the assumption that Rav means to exempt the perjurer, even if he eventually admits his guilt. But what we've got to do here is we've got to look at it and say, listen, there's something very wrong with this. Why? Because Rav challenged Rav Hamnuna from the following brisa. If the householder, who's the householder, an unpaid custodian that's actually house sitting for somebody, that's how we can see it, claimed a claim of theft by a thief regarding a deposit that he had been safekeeping, and he swore to that effect, but then afterwards he felt bad and he admitted that he took the item for himself and that he had sworn falsely, and then witnesses also came and testified that he took the item for himself. This is the law. If he admitted his guilt before the witnesses came and testified against him, he obviously has the chance for atonement, guys, and he pays the principal and the one for surcharge, and he brings the ashram offering to Hashem. But if he admitted his guilt only after the witnesses came and testified against him, he pays the twofold payment because he accused that he was accused that he took the item, and he said no, a thief took it, and therefore because he lied about theft, he's treated as a thief, and therefore it's a twofold payment. If he's an unpaid custodian and said that for some reason the item was lost, he'd only have to pay the principal back. Now, he also brings an ashram offering, which is interesting. And the reason is that there are two laws that converge here. One, now this is very important. One is the law that a person who confesses to having sworn falsely in denial of a monetary obligation pays a surcharge of 1/5 to the victim and brings an ashram offering. Separately, guys, is a law that the unpaid custodian who exempts himself with a false oath that the deposit was stolen, and then he's actually caught out by witnesses, because he stole it himself, is treated as a thief and has to pay the kefil. So if we look at the Bryce's first case where the custodian confesses before the witnesses arrive, he's liable for atonement, can pay the one for surcharge, but not the kefil, because the kefil is a fine. And if you admit to a fine before witnesses convict you, then you only have to pay the principal, okay? Even if witnesses come afterwards. In the Bryce's second case, where the custodian only confessed after the witnesses arrived, he pays the kefil because his crime was initially revealed through witnesses, and the confession came too late to exempt him from the fine. So he doesn't have to pay the additional fifth, because although he confessed to a false oath, payment of the surcharge is covered by that of kefil. So that's interesting by Rashi. Technically, the witnesses and the confession both render him liable to kefil and the one for surcharge, because it's not like he has to pay the kefil and he denied it. He came clean after the witnesses. So within the kefil is the one for surcharge to the victim, and he brings an ashram offering to still offer him atonement. Because, guys, since both fees are payable to the same person, the depositor, it's not necessary for the custodian to pay them separately, the kefil and the ashram. It's covered within it because the principal is paid. Now the kefil is used as the one for surcharge. And there's an atonement basis. So there is both, as long as after he's caught by witnesses, he kind of admits to it. So the kefil payment is deemed to include the one for surcharge as well. This is the opinion of Rav Yaakov. There's obviously a whole discussion, surprise, surprise. Okay, now let's see how long we've got left. We've got 4 minutes left. Let's just see where we're coming. So obviously the twofold payment includes the principal. Now here you cannot say that the brisa refers to either case where the defendant swore outside of court or case where the plaintiff jumped up and personally adjured him in court, because the brisa states that if witnesses testified against him before he confessed, he's liable to the twofold payment. And guys, that payment is only assessed when you swear falsely in court and the oath was imposed by the court. So the brisa rules that when he confessed or when he was contradicted by witnesses after swearing falsely, he must pay the principal. Now, this is the problem. If Rav meant to exempt the purchaser in all cases, how can you possibly reconcile his opinion with this brisa? We've got 3.5 minutes. We need this. All right, quickly, guys. Okay, then we're done. Rava therefore amends and redefines Rav's ruling. Rather, Rava said, regarding any case where the defendant admits that he swore falsely, regardless of whether he claimed that and swore that the deposit was lost, or he claimed and swore that it was taken by a thief. Rav did not say that the oath exempts him from payment, since it's written explicitly in the Torah that one who confesses that he must pay the principal and the surcharge of 1/5. Furthermore, regarding a case where the defendant claims that the deposit was taken by a thief and witnesses come and testify against him that he took it, Rav also did not say that the oath, haven't finished, that the oath exempts him from payment, since it's written in the Torah that he's liable to the twofold payment. Okay? Let me just mute Kevin again. Sorry, guys. So Rav didn't say that the oath exempts him from payment, since it's written in the Torah that he's liable to the twofold payment. Rather, when did Rav say that a custodian oath exempts him from payment? Regarding a case where the custodian complains, and he says, no, the deposit was stolen, and then he takes a false oath. And he does not confess, but witnesses come and testify to his guilt. Nowhere does the Torah impose a payment upon him, and accordingly Rav interprets the verse, and its owner has to accept the oath, and the defendant shall not pay, as teaching that once the defendant has sworn, he cannot be held liable to pay, and the case is closed. So, guys, all we're saying is as follows: that the custodian, number one, must basically say that the item was lost, like a wolf that stole a sheep. So, if he says that it was stolen by a human being, is treated as a thief if witnesses come against him, and the case is not closed. If it's a court-imposed oath and he doesn't want atonement, and he doesn't come to confess, and he's adamant, and witnesses come afterwards, it's too late, providing he says that it was lost, and it's going to be an unpaid custodian. Do you get what I'm saying? Like a sheep that was taken by a wolf. There's nothing you can do there, but it doesn't protect the custodian if he was caught claiming that a person took it from him, neither does it help if basically witnesses say that they found the item in his house in that particular place. And it doesn't help him if afterwards he confesses and he feels bad, because it gives him an opportunity for atonement. All right, guys, I'm done.
How much time do you have, Damon?
A minute. Go for it, Kev.
Okay, just quickly. Yeah, so I just got off the bus. Okay, so just one interesting fact about the Parashat Balak, and there's a comparison made between Abraham and Bilam. When Abraham was going to sacrifice Yitzchak on the Mizbeach, he saddled his donkey with alacrity, and he took the two young men. Bilam did the same thing, but Bilam was the embodiment of evil, and the point is, he just hated the Jews.